My mother is threatening to disinherit me if I don't make my brother a partner in my company, but he could still afford his mortgage and car loan in that case. Have you ever heard the phrase, don't mix family with business? Well, I'm not sure who said that, but they must have gotten burned many times just like me because they are absolutely right. I'm 43 years old, a man, and I built a business from scratch. It wasn't easy because I come from a tough background. My mother, who is 58, had me when she was just a teenager, and my father left as soon as he found out I was on the way. Her parents were ashamed to have a pregnant teenage daughter and kicked her out of the house, so she had to fend for herself. For the first 17 years of my life, we were extremely poor. No, we weren't just poor, we lived in poverty. Everything changed when I started working. It wasn't immediate, of course. At first, I took any job I could to put food on the table or keep a roof over our heads. Back then, I could have 3 or 4 jobs at the same time. I still had the endless energy of youth, and the fear of going hungry was a great motivator. At one of those jobs, I met Arnold, a man who inspired me with his business acumen. I admired him because, like me, he had come from nothing, and now he had more success than I could have ever imagined. He liked me because I was a smart young man with lots of ambition, so he became my mentor. He closely watched my progress and gave me advice, in addition to giving me opportunities to observe how he ran his businesses. When I was around 20 years old, I felt I had learned enough and presented him with a business idea. Arnold believed in me and my idea and decided to invest in my business. With his guidance and backing, I was able to grow that business little by little into the chain of companies I have today. Arnold is no longer with us, but I thank him every day for how he changed my life. And that brings us to my brother, Nick, who is 40 years old. He's my half-brother, from another unknown father, but I've always just called him my brother. Nick isn't an ambitious person. He seemed to accept our living situation and spent his teenage and early adult years getting into trouble with his friends. When I started working with Arnold, I tried to introduce them. I hoped Nick could learn from him and make positive changes in his life, as I had done. Nick didn't take it seriously, which disappointed me. He said Arnold was full of his own nonsense, and Arnold wasn't very impressed with Nick either. But that didn't stop me from trying to get my brother to take his future seriously. I tried to involve him in my business while it was still growing. Arnold didn't agree and threatened to pull his investment, but I insisted. He was my brother, and I wanted us both to get out of our tough situation together. Arnold understood and relented, although he still thought it was a bad idea. Nick worked exactly one day and then disappeared when he realized he wouldn't get paid a salary. I explained to him that he would earn from the profits, but he said he preferred the certainty of a paycheck. After that, he went back to his job at a local factory, and no attempt to persuade him changed his mind. Why am I bringing up these stories from almost 30 years ago? Because they are the backdrop for what happened a few days ago. My mother asked me to come see her and told me that Nicky as she calls him, wasn't doing well. He was struggling financially and had recently moved in with her. I wasn't surprised. Nick always hit rough patches and always went back to mom during those times. I expected her to ask for some money to help as usual, but what she said next left me speechless. She talked about how Nick was having trouble keeping a stable job, which I already knew very well. Then she asked me to make him a partner in my business. At first, I didn't think I had heard her right. She said the jobs I had given him in the past were too low for him, which is why he never stuck around. According to her, it was embarrassing that the brother of the founder was working as a mere manager. God knows I've tried to help Nick countless times. I've offered him jobs in my companies and even offered to train him for a managerial position, with the promise that he could move up as he gained experience. Each time he worked for a couple of days and then disappeared without saying a word. Eventually, I just stopped trying. You can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved. I explained that I couldn't just give Nick a high position out of nowhere. He lacked a work ethic and wasn't qualified. I was willing to let him start from the bottom and promote him as he gained experience and proved his ability, but making him a partner was out of the question. I had spent more than 20 years building this company from nothing. I wasn't going to hand over part ownership of my business to him. But he's your brother, my mother said, as if that meant he was entitled to the decades of hard work I had put in. I responded that yes, he was my brother, and I did care about him, which is why I had tried to involve him in the business when it was starting out. That's why I had given him so many opportunities, which he had squandered every time. I was done giving him chances. I asked how much money he needed, and my mom interrupted saying, "We don't want your handouts." Then she added that since I had become successful, I had used my money as a tool to control them both. She claimed I only gave them enough to survive so that they'd have to come back to me for more when they needed it. She accused me of not wanting to make Nick a partner so that he couldn't become financially independent. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Did she think I enjoyed having to support the two of them? Nick was a grown man who couldn't hold down a job and spent his money on alcohol and gambling. My mother, although not much older than me, was already an aging woman, and yet I made sure she was comfortable. I paid the mortgage on the house where she lived, where Nick lived most of the time. I also took care of her car loan and sent her money every month for her needs and bills. That usually amounted to thousands of dollars a month just to keep her happy. I wasn't trying to control anyone, I was just trying to help them. I told her I had been more than generous. I wasn't trying to control anyone, and I had already given Nick more than enough opportunities, and each time he threw them in my face. I explained that I didn't run a simple hot dog stand. I managed a business with branches across the country. Making Nick a partner wouldn't help him or my company. With his lack of knowledge and experience, he would destroy my business, ruining not only my hard work, but also the livelihood of many employees who depended on me. It would be the worst business decision I could make. My mother gave me a look I hadn't seen since I was a child. She said, "Family is what matters most, but you care more about employees who have nothing to do with you." I told her she was twisting my words, but she ignored me and added, "We all struggled together, and your success should be our success." Her words were beginning to reek of entitlement, and it was starting to irritate me. I explained that yes, we had struggled together as a family, but I was the only one who had fought to build this business. I agreed that family was important, but my business was mine. They had no say in any decisions regarding it. I also added that she needed to stop coddling Nick so he could learn to fend for himself. My mother wasn't listening to me. She shouted that I didn't want to see them succeed and that they didn't need me. Then she gave me an ultimatum. Either I make my brother a partner in my company, or she would disinherit me. Honestly, I wanted to laugh because I thought it was a bad joke, but she was serious. I asked her if she would really disinherit me for not giving my brother something he didn't deserve. She said yes, and that I didn't deserve to be part of this family if I didn't commit to our collective success. At that moment, I let my frustration come to the surface. I told my mom that she didn't care about Nick's success. She just felt entitled to everything I had built. I told her that if she thought disinheriting me was the best course of action, then I wouldn't argue with her. She yelled that she didn't want to see me again, and I left her house, furious. It's been a few days and I can't get that argument out of my head. I keep replaying the conversation, trying to understand it. The sense of entitlement and ingratitude just overwhelmed me. Had I really not done enough for my brother? I worked hard to get where I am, to lift our entire family out of poverty, and instead of being proud of me, they were trying to take advantage of my success. It's too much to process right now, so I decided to write it all down. I hoped that putting this mess into words would give me some perspective, but I'm just as confused and hurt as before. Update 1. I didn't make any hasty decisions about how to move forward with the situation involving my mother and brother. I've always had a principle, both in business and in my personal life, not to make important decisions when I'm emotionally affected. So far it's always worked for me, and I was confident it wouldn't fail me this time. I think it was about a week before I realized I couldn't completely detach from my emotions in this decision. It involved my family, and you can never fully separate emotions when it comes to them. So I did something I rarely do. I asked a trusted friend for advice. He also owns a business and had gone through complicated family situations a few years ago. I thought he could give me an objective opinion. We met one night for drinks, and I told him everything. He knew about my family history and Nick's struggles, so I only had to talk about the conversation with my mom and the ultimatum she gave me. He told me pretty much the same thing the comments on my original post had said. My mom was crossing boundaries, and Nick saw me as his safety net. He said it would be painful, but I needed to set boundaries. If that meant refusing to bow to my mother's ultimatum, then so be it. It was hard to hear. I loved my mom and my brother, but he was right. I wasn't going to let them use me. If my mom wanted to disinherit me because I wouldn't give in to unreasonable demands, then I was no longer her son. A few days later, my mom called and asked if I had made a decision yet. I simply told her that she had already made the decision, and I would respect it. She started yelling at me again and calling me greedy and ungrateful before I hung up and blocked her number. I was willing to cut ties with my family, but not without first showing them what it really meant to cast me out. I made a few calls to stop the automatic payments for the mortgage and the car loan for my mom. I didn't bother notifying her. She would figure it out soon enough when they started calling her and sending her notifications about the missed payments. It took about a month for my mom to realize what was happening. I had already blocked her number, so she couldn't call me. Instead, one day, I came home to find her sitting on my doorstep. I braced myself for another round of yelling and insults as I approached, but that didn't happen. She simply said hello, as if our last argument had never occurred, and then asked how I had been. Crossing my arms, I looked at her and asked, "What are you doing here?" She frowned and asked what I meant by that. I told her I didn't expect to see her anywhere near my house since she didn't want anything to do with me. I was surprised when she laughed and put her hand on my shoulder. That doesn't mean anything, you know. People say things they don't mean when they're going through an emotional storm. I told her I didn't know that. I was raised to say what I meant at all times, even when I was angry. She didn't like that I was using her own words against her. She told me to stop being petty, and that I needed to be mature. I could see another argument brewing, and I didn't want to deal with it after a long, hard day, so I walked past her and unlocked the door to my house. She tried to follow me in, but I just closed the door in her face and locked it. She tried to open it, and when she realized it was locked, she started shaking it violently. I yelled for her not to break the door, but she didn't listen. She kept yelling for me to open it immediately. I sat on the floor in the hallway, listening to my mom have a little breakdown. It wasn't pleasant to hear, but part of me was glad because I thought maybe she was finally learning the lesson. I'm not just a money source that can be treated however they please. I think she realized that I wasn't going to respond to threats or yelling because she eventually stopped shaking the door and lowered her voice. Finally, she asked what was going to happen with the mortgage and the car loan. I considered not answering and pretending I had gone to another part of the house. But I decided there was no point in delaying the conversation. She was already there, so no need to push it to another day. I told her her son was paying for those things and that I was no longer her son. She had another son who could take over where I had left off. She was quiet for so long that I thought she had left. When I looked through the peephole, she was still there. Finally, she said Nick wasn't capable of paying for any of those things. I told her that wasn't my problem. Around that time, I started getting a headache, so I went upstairs to take an aspirin and hoped she would be gone when I came back down. Fortunately, she was gone by the time I returned later. I had a few days of peace after that, and I thought my mom had finally gotten the message. That was until she showed up with my brother. This time, they intercepted me in the parking lot of my office. Nick looked the same as the last time I saw him, unkempt and like he needed a couple of good meals. Life hadn't been kind to him. I felt bad for him for a moment, but I remembered all the times I tried to help him get his life on track, giving him jobs and money, and how he squandered those opportunities every time. I couldn't think of a meaningful way to help him. I could give him $1 million today, and it would be gone in 2 months. How do you help someone like that? Nick immediately confronted me and accused me of abandoning our mother. It was barely past noon, and I could already smell the alcohol on his breath. I told him she had disinherited me and that he needed to get out of my way. He grabbed my shirt and tried to shake me, but it wasn't very successful. We are the same height, but I take good care of my body. I go to the gym at least 3 times a week and play squash on the weekends. He, on the other hand, is skinny and had already had a few drinks. He couldn't move me, and I don't know why he thought hitting me by surprise would be a good idea. As usually happens with a surprise punch, it caught me off guard. I stumbled a little while he laughed. I hit him back and knocked him onto his back. My mother screamed and stepped between us, but I noticed she extended her arms to protect Nick, maybe because she knew he was in more danger if we ended up fighting, or because she had taken his side. I just wiped the blood from my lip and tried to fix my shirt. I don't want to see either of you here again unless you come with an apology. You both made your decision, and now you have to live with it. I wasn't going to be responsible for their bad decisions anymore. My mother started crying and begging, but I was done. They were both adults, and I had done more than enough for them time and time again. I had actively tried to improve my brother's life, and I had paid thousands of dollars a month for my mother to have a comfortable life. And they repaid me by excluding me, ambushing me, and attacking me. I told them I was finished with them, and that I would call the police if I saw them again on my property, whether at home or at my business. My mother kept crying, but the mention of the police scared Nick, and he started dragging her away. It's been a few weeks since then, and I haven't heard anything from my mother. I've received a few notifications about the canceled payments and a foreclosure threat on the mortgage. I expect to receive a similar threat for the repossession of the car soon. Nick came to my house one day, raising both hands in a gesture of peace. I decided not to call the police just yet and hear what he had to say. He looked better than the last time I saw him, sober, and he seemed to be making an effort to take better care of himself, though he still looked tired and miserable. He didn't beg for forgiveness or anything like that. He just said he was afraid our mother would end up on the street when the house was foreclosed. I told him I wasn't going to change my stance. To my surprise, he said he understood and only asked for help in finding her a place to live once she was evicted. I told him I would cover 6 months of rent for a small apartment for her, but after that they would be on their own. Part of me felt weak for even offering them that help, but I reminded myself that this would be the last type of assistance they'd get from me and that it was being offered entirely on my terms. Maybe one day I'll reconnect with my family if they manage to stand on their own feet and learn to respect boundaries. Because no matter what happens, there will always be a soft spot when it comes to family. But until then, I'll focus on my business, knowing that I did everything I could for them, and they threw it in my face. Update 2. 8 months have passed since I agreed to pay 6 months of rent as a final offer for both him and my mother to straighten out their lives. When I made this offer, I naively thought they would use the time wisely. But here I am, writing this update because reality has proven otherwise. First, I have to clarify that the rent I secured for them wasn't remotely as nice as the house they had been living in, the one whose mortgage I had been paying until I stopped. It wasn't luxurious or spacious, but it was a roof over their heads, enough for them to have a place to sleep and reorganize their lives, enough for someone who wanted to make the most of a second chance. However, there were problems right from the start. In the first 2 months, both my mother and my brother came back asking me for money to cover other expenses, food, utilities, and even money for transportation. They told me my mother's salary wasn't enough to cover everything, and that Nick was having trouble finding stable work. I'd heard this story before, the same excuse as always, so I stood firm. The rent was the maximum I was going to pay. If they couldn't manage with that, there would be no more to pay. If they couldn't organize themselves with that, there was nothing else I could do. And at that moment, it seemed like they understood. After I made it clear that they wouldn't receive any more support from me, they stopped asking me for money, which made me think they were finally taking the message seriously. It gave me a false sense of hope, as if they had accepted their new reality and were finally going to get their act together. However, that feeling didn't last long. The months passed, and the 6 months of rent I had paid eventually ran out. The result, of course, was exactly what I feared. They were both evicted because they didn't have the money to cover the rent once my help ran out. The most frustrating part is that it didn't come as a surprise to them. They knew from the start that they had a time limit, that they had to act and find a way to support themselves. And yet, they did nothing. We're talking about 2 adults here, my mother, who has a job and, while it doesn't pay very well, it's enough for a responsible person. And my brother, who, despite his history of problems, isn't incapable of working. He should be able to get at least a modest job to help cover his share of the rent. But here we are, with 2 adults unable to maintain a simple apartment when they knew they had a deadline. After the eviction, they came back to my house, ambushing me once again without warning. This time, they came with similar excuses. My mother argued that her salary wasn't enough, and Nick told me he had been fired from his last job. Their intentions were clear. They wanted me to start paying their rent again for a few months until, supposedly, they found a solution. This time, I didn't lose my temper. I listened without interruptions, but when they finished, I made it clear that I had closed that chapter. I was not going to finance their irresponsibility any longer. I stood firm and gave them an ultimatum. Either they left on their own, or I would call the police. At first, they thought I was joking, that I wouldn't dare call, but when they saw I was actually dialing, panic overtook them. They left before the officers arrived, but I had to stay to explain to the police what had happened. At least that served as a warning. I'm no longer playing their game. After that, the only information I've received is that both are now staying in a shelter. I don't know exactly how they ended up there, but I imagine they had no other options after being evicted. It's hard to imagine my mother, a woman who had so many opportunities to live comfortably, falling so low. It must be a humiliating experience, no doubt, but I can't feel sorry for someone who had everything handed to them on a silver platter and instead chose to waste it over and over again. When I gave them the 6 months of rent, I knew I might be making another effort in vain, but I held on to the hope that maybe this time they'd finally learn their lesson. But that didn't happen. You can't help someone who's not willing to help themselves, and that's exactly the case here. At least it served as a lesson to know that second chances aren't always a good idea. I don't know what the future holds for them, but I know my time helping them is over. Update 3. It's been 2 years since the last time I was here talking about my family, and I've received many requests for an update, so here I am, sharing what I know. Starting with my mother, it seems she has improved her life, albeit modestly. After being in such a desperate situation, sleeping in a homeless shelter, any improvement is significant. She's currently got an apartment and, from what I know, is relatively independent. I don't know if her situation is much better than before, but at least she's surviving on her own, and that's already progress for someone who, until recently, was entirely dependent on me for everything. The independence she has achieved, though limited, is something I honestly didn't think she would reach. The interesting part is that I haven't helped her at all in this process. I've had no contact with my mother during these 2 years. She's still upset with me, or at least that's what I've been told. I guess she still holds a grudge for cutting off financial support, but as far as I'm concerned, cutting ties has been the best decision for both of us. Don't get me wrong, there are days when I wonder if I should reach out to her, but I always come back to the same conclusion: it would be a setback. If I reconnect with her, I know she'd start asking for help again, for money, and this whole toxic cycle would begin all over again. Now that she's gotten used to standing on her own 2 feet, I don't want to be the one to make her regress. As for my brother, the news isn't as positive. Although it's not surprising, it's still sad. He always had problems with gambling and alcohol, and it seems he's continued down that path. I don't know exactly where he is because he's disappeared from everyone's sight. I learned all this through third parties, the same people who told me about my mother, and apparently he's left town. My best guess is that he fled due to debts, something that wouldn't be strange in his situation, but it's also possible that he did it in search of a fresh start or some opportunity. The last thing I knew about him before he disappeared is that he was living on the street. I saw it with my own eyes once, wandering around the city. He looked exactly as you'd imagine, exhausted, unkempt, like someone who had let life's worst drag him down. It was hard to see him like that, but there wasn't much I could do. As I've said before, no matter how much you try to help someone who doesn't want to be helped, you can give them all the opportunities, give them money, give them a job, but if there's no will to change, none of it will work. The funny thing is, there's a rumor that's been circulating, and while I can't confirm it, I've heard that he might be working with his biological father. I don't know how true it is, but if it is, I'm glad for him. Maybe if that's true, he's finding some stability, something he could never achieve here. I know he had a very fractured relationship with his father, but maybe that reconnection has given him a chance for change. In any case, that's all I know for now. It's not an update full of happy endings, but that's life sometimes. My mother seems to be on the right track, while my brother is still lost in his own chaos. I don't know if I'll ever reconcile with them or if things will change significantly, but for now, this is how things stand.